Hello everyone, my name is Lowko and welcome to another World of Warcraft video. Now today we're gonna be having a look at a more of a beginner sort of video. A lot of people have been recently asking me questions about World of Warcraft and where to really start. One of the most asked questions is, what class do I play? And honestly, that is one of the most difficult ones ever, because class you cannot change. Likely when you're gonna choose a class, you're gonna stick with it for at least a month or so. So choosing a class wisely and leveling up the class that you actually enjoy is going to be one of the most important things. So today we're going to be talking about choosing a realm, choosing a faction, choosing a race, and choosing a class. Now the first three are quite easy. I'm currently playing, by the way, on the Warlocks of Draenor Alpha or Beta server. So, you know, the realms aren't really going to be very interesting right here. But basically, the one thing you want to make sure that when you choose a realm is that it is a realm on the actual European or North American server, or maybe on the Asian server if you're from Asia. Just make sure you're on the correct server, making sure that it says like EU. And if you're not completely sure, just Google it. But make sure, I've heard a couple of people, make sure that you are playing on the European server if you're from Europe, and not on the North American one, because, well, you cannot switch over the characters. Other than that, when choosing a realm and a server, just make sure you choose the one that has at least some people playing on it. I personally prefer realms that are at least high in population. You will see, you know, like here the population says high right here. You will see all kinds of servers, but just make sure you choose a server that's high. And obviously if you're playing with friends, make sure you choose the server that has the friends on it. And that's pretty much it as far as server go. I would advise you to make sure you're on the correct one, so on the EU one or the NA one or the Asian one, and to make sure you choose a high population one because you will just meet way more people. The auction house will be a lot more interesting, and you know, things will just be a lot more enjoyable if you're not playing by yourself. So that's the very first thing as far as servers go. Next, we're gonna be discussing the Horde and the Alliance. So basically, in World of Warcraft you have two factions. You got the Alliance, which contains of the humans, the dwarves, the Night Elf, the gnomes, the Draenei, and the Worgen. And on the other side you have the Horde, which is the Orc, the Undead, the Tauren, Trolls, Blood Elves, and Goblins. Now basically, if you're an Alliance player, you will be enemies with the Horde, and if you're a Horde player, you will be enemies with the Alliance. It is as simple as that. Both factions have different cities, and they most of the time also have like different questing hubs and like different places you can go. So honestly, I cannot really give you a good perspective on what you will prefer, because it really doesn't matter. But just keep in mind is that if you are playing with friends and your friends are playing Horde and you choose to decide a Alliance character, you will not be able to communicate with them, okay? Because, you know, you will just be able to attack each other if you're on a PvP server. So just make sure you're playing the same faction as your friends are. Now, I personally quite prefer the Alliance, but I don't mind the Horde. I quite like the different cities they have. And that is one of the main differences as well that I forgot to mention. The capital cities, every single race has a capital city. Obviously, if you're an Orc player, you will not be able to go to Stormwind, which is the human city, and the same goes for the humans. You will not be able to go to Orgrimmar, which is the Orcs' capital city. So that's one of the things you gotta keep in mind. If you really aren't sure, I would just do the very next thing, which is choosing a race. Just choose the race that you find most awesome. Now, there are a couple of racial benefits that you have. For example, humans have a thing called every man for himself, which I believe is gonna get changed actually in Warlocks of Draenor. So honestly, when it comes to racial traits, the one thing you gotta keep in mind is that if you're gonna play a human, you're gonna have to look at that character for a long time. So if you don't enjoy the looks of a human, don't play a human. Just simply choose a race that looks awesome to you and go from there. Alright? Alright. Now we're getting into the most difficult part, okay? We have discussed so far factions, server/realms, as well as the race. Now the most difficult part is choosing a class. Because races you can change, okay? You can pay a little bit of money and you can change the race of your character. You can even change faction of your character as well. The one thing though that's most complicated to discuss would be the class. Now the classes, as you can see, are here on the right side of the screen, and there's warriors, paladins, hunters, rogues, priests, shamans, mages, warlocks, monks, druids, and death knights. Now these things are basically the role that you're going to do in World of Warcraft. Well, mages kind of speak for themselves, and same goes for the warrior, right? But there's a couple in here that might be a little bit more complicated, so I'm gonna try my best to explain what class you maybe want to be playing and the differences between the classes, because some of them at first glance will look very, very familiar. Now, the first thing you gotta keep in mind is that every single class is strong, okay? There's no, like, strongest class. I see that question coming along pretty often, like, what is the strongest class? There really isn't any. All classes are good in their own right, and all classes, you know, have their own strengths and their own weaknesses. So there is no thing such as a best class. Second thing to keep in mind is that not every race can play every class. So, for example, the humans cannot play a Shaman. If you want to play a Shaman as Alliance, for example, you can go Draenei, in which case you will be able to choose the Shaman. And Dwarves as well, they can also choose Shaman. So that is one of the things you need to keep in mind as well, that some race class combinations are not available. Alright, so in World of Warcraft, there are basically three main roles you can have. You can be a tank, you can be a DPSer, and you can be a healer. Now, a tank basically means you're going to be the one that runs in first and grabs all the minions, when you're playing in a group format, obviously. You're the one that grabs all the minions, make sure you got them all fighting against you, while you let the DPSers, which are the damage dealers, do that job, and the healers obviously heal the rest of the group. Usually, if you are a tank, you will be expected to sort of lead the group because you're the one going in first. So most World of Warcraft players will expect you to know at least what you're doing. And also one of the main things as a tank is that you will be very often, if things go wrong, be assigned blame, okay? Because you know, you're the one going in first, you're the one supposed to creep all the aggro of all the minions and all the monsters and whatnot. So if you're gonna play a tank, make sure you can handle some criticism, and make sure that you are the one that wants to lead a group and the one that actually will not deal a whole lot of damage, but will just be able to tank all the minions. Now, the healers obviously go for themselves. It's quite easy, quite straightforward. You just need to keep the health of all the groups up. And last but not least, you have the DPSers, which would be the damage dealers. And they're the ones that will actually be taking down the bosses. So this trinity of the different roles is the very basics of World of Warcraft and very important when choosing a class. For example, a warrior can deal DPS and a warrior can tank, but a warrior cannot be a healer. So that is one of the things you need to be keeping in mind. Now, first off, we're gonna be discussing tanks. What roles or what class can you choose as a tank? Tanks have 4 different classes. There's the warrior, which is right here. You have a tanking spec, which allows you to be a tank and allows you to take on all these minions that I was talking about. Then you also have the Paladin. The Paladin is also a tanking class in World of Warcraft. Then you also have the Monk right here. You actually have 5 different classes, I said 4 right there. You have the Monk, which also has a tanking spec. Then you have the Death Knight, which also have a tanking spec. And last but not least, you have the Druids. Let's go to the Night Elf one for that. The Druids also do have a tanking spec. Now, I'm not gonna go super in depth in the differences between all of these different classes, but just keep in mind that all of these can be a tank, alright? Next up for healers, what classes can be healers? Once again, right here, let's go to the Druid one. The Druids, where's the Druids? There we go. Druids can be healers, Monks can be healers, Paladins can be healers, once again switching to humans, and Priests and Shamans can also be healers. So this is the Priest right here, and this would be the Shaman. They can all be healers. They are all different once again in all their retrospect, but one of the things you can already start seeing is that some classes have multiple roles. Alright? So, for example, the Druid will have multiple roles where they can both tank and they can heal. But also, they can do DPS and they can do other stuff as well. So, you know, just gotta keep in mind that multiple faction or multiple classes can do multiple different roles. Now, every single other class does have a damage dealing spec. So every single class in the game can deal damage as well. So if you're playing a Priest, which might very well seem like a class that can only do healing, you can also dish out a lot of damage when you decide to specialize yourself in that sort of stuff. So every single class can deal damage. Now what we're gonna do, I'm gonna go from top to bottom every single class, and I'm gonna, you know, talk about the the specifics of that class and what it's good at and what it's weak at. So first off, we have the Warrior. Now the Warrior is a pretty straightforward one where you can deal damage and you can do some tanking as well. And I gotta say, a lot of tanks that I see are most of the time Warriors. You wear big axes, you wear plate armor, and you're just sort of like the warrior of the party. It doesn't, you know, there's a couple of ways you can talk about it, but you're just the straight up warrior. Now warriors, instead of like having mana to do like spells and whatnot, they use a resource called Rage. And Rage is basically a bar that fills up to 100, and every single skill that you try and do will cost some of that Rage. So, opposed to, for example, Paladins right here, Paladins do have mana. So if you're gonna be a Paladin tank, you're gonna have to make sure that you use your spells wisely. Whereas with Warrior, you need to use your energy bar, your rate bar efficiently. Now Paladins can be both damage dealers, as well as healers, as well as tanks. Also Paladins wear plate. So Paladins wear plate and allow you to therefore dish out or take a lot more hits than, for example, a Druid, which we'll go over very quickly. But a Paladin can do all three classes. Now, in general, Paladins aren't very fast, they aren't very mobile, but they just sort of stand by themselves very easily. So Paladins, especially if you're like solo playing and just having one character, Paladins are very solid all around because, well, maybe you don't enjoy dealing damage anymore, you can switch into a healing spec. Or if you don't enjoy healing anymore, you can switch into a tanking spec. So that's as far as Paladins and Warriors go. Next, we have a pure damage dealing class, which is the Hunter. It's currently the class that I enjoy playing a ton. This is a pure damage dealing class, meaning that the only thing you can really do is deal damage, alright? You have a similar system to the Warrior where you don't have Rage, but you got a energy bar as well, forcing you to choose skills, and obviously the energy will recharge, but you can't be in combat and just spam all your abilities like a Paladin, for example, can. Now a Hunter, one of the most important things that a Hunter has, as you can see sitting right here to the left of him, is indeed a, well, left of his obviously, right on the screen, is indeed a pet. So as a Hunter, you can tame pets. So while you're a pure DPS dealing class, you basically are a two-man team, because at every single point in the game you will have a pet next to you. Well, unless you're a really terrible hunter and you don't use your pet. Now the pet that you see standing next to the different classes, as you can see right here, they are just the starting pets. So, well, as a gnome you can't play a hunter. But these are just the starting pets. So you can actually tame different pets in the games. There's some very rare ones that, you know, are all different. You can do just basically specialized things as a hunter, and you can deal a lot of damage, but you gotta keep in mind you gotta have to manage your pet as well. So a hunter is a ranged DPS class that shoots with bow and arrow. There is really no way to melee as a hunter. Next up, talking about melee damage, we got the Rogue. The Rogue is a stealthy assassin. So basically what you do, you go in stealth and you basically try and deal as much damage in as little amounts of time as possible. Now once again for the Rogue as well, we also have an energy bar and they have a specific system using combo points. Now I'm not gonna go in depth on that, but the Rogue is sort of like the melee version of the Hunter. They're very similar in a lot of ways, but the Rogue does not have a pet, and the most important thing is that you can go stealth, meaning that you won't really be seen, and you are in melee combat, so you're a close combat class, opposed to the Hunter that is always standing at a distance. Once again, the Rogue is also a purely damage dealing class, so you cannot be a healer and you cannot be a tank. Next up we have the Priest. The Priest is basically the best, so to say, healer in the game, where you have two different specializations. One is basically allowing your spells to shield your allies, and the other one would be to actually heal your allies most of the time. So those are in the very basic forms the way you deal damage, but you can also play a show called Shadow Priest, and the Shadow Priest is very good at dealing damage as well. Now Shadow Priests are mostly damage over time minions, meaning that you do a spell and for the next like 10 seconds that spell will do damage. So you don't really have a big burst as a priest if you decide to do damage. But let's say you are currently playing a Shadow Priest and you want to be a healer, great. Just simply change the specialization and go from there. So if you want to be playing a priest, you do not need to be purely damage, or you do not need to be purely healing either. Priest Shadow DPS is indeed from ranged, so you are a ranged damage dealer, sort of like the Hunter, but with a lot more damage over time and a lot more mage-like spells. Next up we have the Shaman. The Shaman is a special class that actually uses totems, so you can see that thing standing right here. Totems are basically things you call down from the heavens that will aid you in combat. So you can, for example, have like a flame tongue totem that deals some damage, and there's just all kinds of different totems that allow you to deal with specific situations in different ways. Now, as far as the class or of the specializations that they have, as a shaman you can be a healer, but you can also be a damage dealing from ranged with sort of like spells and whatnot, and you can be a close combat damage dealer as well. So as a shaman, you can be a healer, you can be a close combat fighter, sort of like a rogue, and you can be a long distance fighter, sort of like a hunter / shadow priest. Next up we have the mage. Now the mage is once again a pure damage dealing unit, sort of like the hunter as well as the rogue, but the mage is, well, sort of as it sounds like a mage, where you cast spells and you work with mana and all that sort of stuff. And there's different specializations. You can be a fire mage, you can be an arcane mage, you can be a frost mage, all having their strengths and weaknesses. But all in all, mage is a very strong burst class, allowing you to do a lot of damage from a distance, but you're also quite flimsy, so you don't really have a lot of armor. As you can see, this guy is wearing cloth right here, whereas, for example, a rogue is wearing leather and a hunter is wearing mail armor. A mage is quite obviously a glass cannon, allowing you to do a lot of damage, but you're quite flimsy as well. Now, once again, the mage cannot heal, and the mage can also not tank, obviously, as you might have guessed. Next up we have a Warlock. Warlock, once again, being a damage dealing class, and once again a class that deals all the damage from a distance. Now, compared to a mage, a Warlock, all of his spells are pretty much damage over time. You also have some instant casts and things like that, but most of the time when you play a Warlock, you're expected to deal damage over time. So that will mean that you cast a spell and it will deal damage over the next 20 or so seconds. Also, a Warlock is a cloth wearer just like a mage, and you cannot tank, and you can also not be a healer. Next up we have the Monk. The Monk can be all three, so they can be a tank, they can be a healer, and they can be a damage dealer, and that is a melee damage dealer, sort of like the rogue, I guess you could say. And they can do all different kind of classes, but not as much as the next one, which would be the Druid. The Druid can be a melee DPS, they can be a ranged DPS, they can be a tank, and they can also be a healer. So if you aren't completely certain on what class you need to be playing, the Druid can do it all, okay? So if you are very confused about all the things that are happening, if you're playing a Druid, you can sort of do a little bit of everything, but obviously not at once, but you can do pretty much everything. And if you don't enjoy being a tank, well, you can switch it to a melee DPS, and if you don't enjoy melee DPS, you can do a ranged DPS class. So that is a very nice way to start out WoW if you are confused about the class you want to be playing, because, you know, the Druid is just very, very solid all around. Now, the nice thing about Druids is that Druids can be shapeshifters. So, for example, the tanking spec is a Druid in a bear form, and the DPS, like the melee DPS form, is a Druid in a cat form that deals a lot of damage. And the Druid is basically a shapeshifter where you're not really showing up like this all that often if you're actually playing. Most of the time you will be in one of your forms. Next up we have the Death Knight, which is the only hero class currently in World of Warcraft. They will start at level 55. And the Death Knight can be a tank, and they can also be damage dealers. Sort of like the Warrior, but the Warrior works with a rage system, whereas the Death Knight works with a rune system, which is a little bit complicated. But if you're just now starting off in World of Warcraft, you're gonna have to level a character to level 55 anyway before you can play the Death Knight. But I hope this clears up some confusion when it comes to playing World of Warcraft. And if you have any more questions about it, feel free to post them in the comment section right below that like button. I will try my best to answer every single comment that you might have. So if you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit that like button. If you really enjoyed it and you want to see more, hit that subscribe button, because you will be the very first one to get a notification when I upload new videos. I want to thank you guys all for watching. Have an amazing day. Do not forget to smile, and I will see you again in the next video.